Here we are together once again to welcome a new year, this year, 5,781. These words seem so fitting and appropriate, so natural and obvious to be uttered on Erev Rosh Hashanah. And yet this year there is something a little ironic about hearing these words. Here we are together once again to welcome the new year, because we know how different this year is from any other year that we can remember. First, this year is different because despite all that we have done to try to help each other and all of us feel connected and close as part of the Temple Beth Israel family, I am aware that as I speak to you tonight, I am looking into a camera instead of looking into your faces. That's just one small part of how the coronavirus pandemic has changed our lives and altered our reality over the last 6 months. Even as I acknowledge the stress and the strain of those months, even as I recognize the sadness and regret, the suffering and illness and death that the pandemic has caused, even as I take note of the isolation and alienation experienced by so many of us as we strive to remain safe and healthy, I want to say that even though I can't see you right now, I nonetheless feel your presence, and I feel close to you. I feel as though we are connected by the invisible bonds of community and caring and friendship, the bonds that persist and endure despite distance and absence. This year is also different because while this is the 34th time that I have welcomed the new year as Rabbi of Temple Beth Israel, it is also the last time that I will do so in that capacity as I prepare for retirement at the end of next June of 2021 and transition into the role of Rabbi Emeritus. As Rabbi Emeritus, I will still be part of the TBI family, although in a different capacity. I'm confident that in the years to come, we will remain connected with those same bonds of community and caring and friendship that have grown over the years that we have been together. In light of this being my last high holy days as your rabbi, I thought it might be fitting to spend some time talking with you about what I have come to believe, the core ideas and values that have held me in good stead throughout my rabbinate and that have grown and deepened over the years. My hope is that by sharing with you what I believe, I might inspire you to use these holy days to think about what you believe and how your beliefs might influence how you live your life. Tonight, I want to talk with you about my belief in God. I believe that God exists, that there is, as our prayer book proclaims, one God in heaven and earth. I believe it because I can't know it, at least not in the traditional scientific sense of knowledge. And I certainly can't prove it, at least not in the traditional scientific sense of proof. By saying that I believe in God and I believe that God exists, I mean to say that it is a notion that I accept even though there is no irrefutable proof, and even though I might sometimes have doubts. My belief in God's existence resides not in my intellectual capacity, but rather in the realm of the spiritual. I imagine that there is an aspect in my existence that is not simply the sum total of the atoms and molecules that make up my physical being. It is, of course, inescapably true that I could not be me without those atoms, but at the same time, I imagine that I am more than a combination of atoms. I imagine that I have a soul, a spiritual existence. And even though my soul does not have physical corporeality, that does not mean that it isn't real, that it doesn't exist. There are, after all, many things that do not have physical properties, but are nonetheless real. Ideas, for example, or time, or love. And just as I imagine that I have a soul, so I imagine that the universe has a soul. And just as I imagine that I would not be me without my intangible, incorporeal, but nonetheless real soul, so I imagine that the universe would not be what it is without that intangible, incorporeal, but nonetheless real essence that I choose to call God. Somehow, I imagine that something exists that serves to unify all that there is, that serves to transcend the sum total of matter that makes up the universe, and provides for deeper meaning to our existence. My thoughts about my own soul and what it is and how it works are often intellectually inconsistent, sometimes even contradictory, sometimes fuzzy, and usually difficult to articulate in words. And so likewise, my belief in God is often intellectually inconsistent, sometimes even contradictory, sometimes fuzzy, and usually difficult to articulate in words. I'm aware that what I imagine God to be is so other than, so different than anything else in my experience that it is virtually impossible cogently to express it in words. When we speak of God, it seems more appropriate to use the vocabulary of music or poetry than to use the vocabulary of physics or mathematics. A particular piece of music can lift the spirits of some while leaving others cold. A certain poem might deeply resonate for one person while moving another not at all. Intellectually, I'm attracted to Mordechai Kaplan's characterization of God as, quote, the force for good in the universe, or the power that makes for salvation. And yet, here comes the inconsistency. There are times when I feel it's more apt to say that I feel God's hand holding me up, or if you like, that I feel the uplift of God's presence in my life. Intellectually, I reject the idea that God is controlling what goes on down here on earth. Rather, I am firmly committed to the idea that we control our own actions, that we have free will and we have individual ethical responsibility. And yet I am somehow spiritually drawn to the idea of covenant, specifically the idea of the Jewish people's covenant with God, that God somehow cares about us and somehow cares about what we do. And sometimes I'm aware of feeling close to God, even though I'm not exactly sure what that means. I somehow feel duty-bound to respond to God's commanding presence. Torah tugs on my soul, and I feel the demands have a prior claim on my life. Because I believe in the power that makes for salvation, I open myself to the possibility of tapping into that power, even a little, in order to try to make the world better, even a little. Because I have no words to express it, I depict that tapping into the power by saying that I feel God's presence in my life, by imagining coming close to God. I imagine that I'm coming close to God when I gaze upon the rugged beauty of nature, when I stand in the backyard of our family's cottage in Michigan, for example, and I look up at the magnificent starry skies on a cool, clear night, and I'm filled with amazement and gratitude, and I feel close to God. I imagine that I'm coming close to God when I feel the love of family. When we gather as a family around the Pesach table, telling the story of our people in our family's unique way, then I'm struck by the sense of God's presence that I feel, the awe that I experience in relationships and in love and in laughter, and what they can bring out in our lives, and I feel close to God. I imagine that I'm coming close to God when I engage with the words of Torah, when I hear them chanted from the sacred scrolls, or read them in the pages of Talmud, or learn them from wisdom of contemporary scholars, or hear them from Sunday school children, then I feel connected to the age-old tradition passed down from master to disciple, from teacher to student, from grandparents to parents to children, and I feel close to God. I imagine that I'm coming close to God when I pray each morning, when I bind myself to God in love and let the words of the prayers course through me and into my subconscious. Then sometimes, on a really good day, I feel my spirit soar, lifting me above the words to a place of awe, and I feel close to God. I imagine that I'm coming close to God when I remember my parents of blessed memory, and then I derive no small measure of comfort, imagining that somehow their souls are living on in the divine presence, and I feel close to God. So if we can imagine coming closer to God, if we can imagine feeling close to God, then we can imagine tapping into that power that makes for salvation. We can imagine becoming partners in working towards that salvation, proclaiming that there is one God in heaven and earth helps us affirm not only that God exists, but also that there is a connectedness that unites all of existence, a oneness that is wholeness and peace. My belief in God leads me to other profound beliefs that I will be sharing with you throughout this Holy Day period. My hope is that by sharing what I believe, I might inspire you to use these holy days to think about what you really believe and how that belief might influence how you live your life. Shana Tova.